Okay, well, we might as well get going. Welcome, everybody. This is a webinar on China's methane mitigation potential, an assessment of costs and uncertainties through 2060. I want to thank Lawrence Berkeley Lab and UC Berkeley for sponsoring the webinar. My name is Ken Alex. I'm with the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment at UC Berkeley. Very exciting to have this panel this evening in this discussion. Perfectly timed. The cost and uncertainty of methane mitigation is now a very specific topic for discussions between the US and China and more broadly on the world stage, with two very important announcements in the past week directly on point. The first, of course, was China's long-awaited methane action plan, released last week with a fair amount of detail and a fair amount of open space to be filled in, which is why this webinar is so on point. And the second was from this week, the US-China Joint Statement on Climate, which calls out methane in particular, and as well as things like subnational action, which is quite relevant to how we deal with methane mitigation. So methane, as you likely know, is particularly important as a climate lever because it is something like 80 times as potent a greenhouse gas as CO2 over a 20-year period. And because it lasts for a shorter time in the environment, so action we take now will give us time and space to take more action on CO2. For today's seminar, we have a terrific group of speakers. We'll have opening remarks and a presentation of Lawrence Berkeley Lab's findings, followed by an expert panel and closing remarks. Let me mention a couple of things. This is being recorded and it'll be available later on Lawrence Berkeley Lab's Electricity Market and Policy webinars webpage. And if you have questions for any of the presenters at any time, feel free to type them into the Q&A function at the base of the screen at any time. And we'll do our best to get you answers to those questions. So with that, let me introduce our first two speakers. Dr. Zhang Lin is the Nat Simons Presidential Chair in China Energy Policy at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, a staff scientist at its Department of Electricity, Market and Policy, and an adjunct professor at the Department of Agriculture and Resources Economics at UC Berkeley. Dr. Lin's research is focused on energy and climate policy, energy and emission pathways with a focus on non-CO2 GHGs, including methane, electricity market and planning, low carbon economic transition, and appliance efficiency issues in China. After Dr. Lin's opening remarks, Nina Khanna will talk about her analysis and findings. She is the Energy and Environmental Policy Research at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, Sustainable Energy and Environmental Systems Department, where she has led an integrated energy and environmental systems modeling. Her recent research focuses on techno-economic modeling and scenario analysis of technologies and policies for accelerating clean energy transition and climate change mitigation in China and globally. So without further ado, Dr. Lin, over to you.
Thank you, Ken, for that nice introduction for serving our moderator today. Welcome to all our panelists and participants to this webinar on China's methane emission scenarios and uncertainties through 2060. Methane is hot. As Ken mentioned, last week, China released its long-awaited national action plan to control methane emission, laying out the overall framework and key focus areas for mitigating this second largest greenhouse gases. Then yesterday, the US and China released the Sunnyland Statement on enhanced cooperation to address the climate crisis, again, calling both countries to work and collaborate on reducing methane and other non-CO2 greenhouse gases, including N2O and F gases. So we are very pleased to see that both countries will incorporate non-CO2 greenhouse gases in their updated NDCs that's coming up fairly soon. So the timing could not be better for this webinar to update you on our analysis of China's methane emission scenarios and uncertainties surrounding them. Next slide. As Ken mentioned already, methane is a very potent and short-lived climate pollutant with more than 80 times the warming impact of CO2 over 20 years. Reducing methane emission is considered critical in limiting temperature rise in the near term. Methane is estimated to be responsible for approximately 30% of today's anthropogenic global warming. Taking targeted action to reducing methane could avoid nearly 0.3 degrees Celsius of warming by the 2040s, thus providing us more time to adopt more ambitious action to reducing carbon emissions. In the near term, measures that reducing methane emission can cut warming more significantly than those that reduce CO2, according to the latest estimates, up to 3 times more effective. In addition to impacts on temperature rise, reducing methane emission could also lead to multiple benefits, including reducing health impact and avoiding losses of agricultural production. Globally, about 150 countries have joined the Global Methane Pledge with a goal of reducing 30% of global methane emission by 2030. The US and China has also affirmed their commitment to reducing methane emissions, both in their joint Glasgow Declaration, as well as now in the Sunnyland Statements. Next. Next slide. Our team has been working on China's non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions since 2017, starting with the collaboration with Tsinghua University, and later expanding our effort to work with other think tanks in China and elsewhere. We developed a bottom-up model for non-CO2 greenhouse gases and model their mitigation effectiveness for methane, F-gas, and N2O for energy, agriculture, waste, and industrial sectors. Our previous analysis have identified roughly 1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent of mitigation potential at an average cost about $10 per ton CO2 equivalent. For China, around 2030. It helps to set the context, how that's related to the global methane pledge goals. And by 2050, adopting known mitigation measures could be reducing non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions by roughly 57%. On the bottom of the slide, listing 2 our previous publications. In this new analysis, we made several updates on emission sources, mitigation measures, and uncertainty estimates. Now I'm turning over to my colleague, Nina Khanna, to present our updated analysis. Over to you, Nina.
Thank you so much, Zhang. So next, I'll talk more about our methodology for modeling China's methane mitigation potential, as well as some key findings and policy implications. So as Zhang mentioned, building on the earlier non-CO2 modeling work that our team did, we developed a separate model for methane emissions and made a number of updates and refinements. In terms of better understanding what's really driving future methane emissions, we first updated key variables that drive methane emission sources, including both historical calibration as well as updated projections of coal production data series that directly affect coal mining emissions. We also updated macroeconomic variables such as population. Then we expanded our analysis to really include two additional emission sources that are not often considered in many of the existing multi-sectoral methane analysis. These include abandoned coal mines, which, as many of you know, are increasing in number with China's coal transition, as well as aquaculture and fisheries. Then in terms of mitigation potential, we really focus on assessing three new opportunities that are receiving greater attention both within China and also globally. The application of biochar, which is essentially partially combusted biomass that can be used as a soil supplement in rice cultivation, can help absorb and reduce methane emissions. Second, for aquaculture and fishery systems, switching from the present shallow extensive systems to more intensive and continuously aerated systems can really help result in higher fish production as well as reduced methane emissions. And then third, we also consider a number of emerging enteric fermentation measures, such as methane inhibiting feed additives and vaccines that are being developed and piloted. And then lastly, as Zhang mentioned, we address uncertainty in methane emissions data in two main ways: by using more granular region-weighted emission factors for the coal mining sector, which is a large emission source, and also by assessing uncertainties in both rice cultivation and enteric fermentation measures in the agriculture sector, which is also another primary sector for methane emissions in China. Then in order to really kind of ensure that our methane model is well calibrated with historical data as well as other greenhouse gas emission inventories, we compared our 2020 estimate with estimates from other US-based organizations such as the Environmental Protection Agency or EPA, as well as the International Energy Agency and also the EDGAR Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventory database. So this bar chart here shows a comparison for our estimate of 2020 with other studies. And we can see that from this comparison, our estimate of 1.9 billion ton of CO2 equivalent is well within the range of other studies, but does fall on the higher end. As seen with our higher estimates of agriculture emissions, which is shown here in green, and then to a smaller extent, energy emissions, this is primarily due to the inclusion of the two additional emission sources I mentioned earlier of abandoned coal mine as well as aquaculture. And it's also important to note by looking across the different studies that there is significant variation in agriculture and waste sector methane emissions, which indicates existing uncertainties with data for estimating these emission sources. Next, I'll talk a little bit about the three primary scenarios that we developed for this study for projecting future methane emissions. First, we developed a reference scenario that really considers the current energy policies, but do not currently consider methane mitigation measures. And it's important to know, as mentioned earlier, that this analysis was really done prior to the release of China's National Methane Action Plan last week. So we hope to update this analysis now that the Methane Action Plan has been released, but we haven't quite had time to do that yet. Then we developed two alternative scenarios that do model specific methane mitigation potential based on the relative cost of individual mitigation measures. So first, we have the cost-effective methane mitigation scenario that assumes the full adoption of individual methane mitigation measures that are below $10 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And adoption happens before 2050. And we also have a deep mitigation scenario where we widen the scope to include higher cost individual mitigation measures of up to $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And at the same time, also consider accelerated and earlier adoption of cost-effective measures. Next, I'll start talking about some of our modeling results and findings. So this first chart here compares the three scenarios in terms of trends in total methane emissions and also highlights the uncertainty ranges for methane emissions under each scenario that resulted from some of the key sources of uncertainty that we analyzed and modeled. But first, as we can see from kind of the change in emissions over time between the three different scenarios, you can see that we assume methane mitigation measures to really be deployed from 2020 onwards. So that's when they start diverging. But in the reference scenario, which is shown in blue, without considering methane mitigation measures, we can see that methane emissions actually do not decline until after 2025. And the decline that happens is primarily a result of the energy transition and reductions in coal mining activity. And based on the error bars that are shown for the total emissions that indicate kind of the range of uncertainty for key emission sources, we can see that there are significant uncertainty ranges in the early years due primarily to coal mine methane and agriculture uncertainties. And as coal mine methane activity decreases alongside China's energy transition away from coal, the uncertainty is also reduced as coal mining emissions also reduces over time. And we can see overall by 2060, there's about a median of 42% reduction from 2060 reference levels in the deep mitigation scenario. And we will look at and also discuss a lot more about the changes in the sectoral reduction potential in the different scenarios over time. Next, we focus in on kind of the two main sources of uncertainty that we modeled. So this chart focuses on one of those largest sources of uncertainty, which is the emission factor for coal mine methane emissions. Based on the latest published research, there's significantly large uncertainty on the order of plus or minus 80% for coal mining emission factor for methane. And this was determined by looking at uncertainty ranges that were identified for the emission factors of China's top 3 coal-producing provinces from a recent study that was published and was able to analyze historical methane emission data from Chinese coal mine database. For coal mine methane, you can see from the chart, the overall uncertainty range falls over time as the economy shifts away from coal consumption and coal mining activity decreases until it's nearly phased out by 2060. And the results also highlight that it's really important to further narrow down this uncertainty range because it is so large by tapping into additional and more updated emission data sources for coal mine methane. For example, by referencing top-down and bottom-up estimates is one way that could potentially help better understand the different sources of uncertainty in coal mine methane emissions. Then the second major source of uncertainty is really in rice cultivation. And this is due primarily to uncertainties in the efficacy and cost of biochar application. In our scenarios, we assume biochar is fully deployed as a methane mitigation measure by 2030. So that's why you see that the mitigation range in biochar efficacy is reflected from 2030 kind of all the way through 2060. And this uncertainty range was identified based on recently published literature that was specific to China. And we can see that by 2060, the median reduction in total rice cultivation methane emissions is about 58% below the reference scenario. So the reduction potential is still quite significant, and the uncertainty range is smaller compared to coal mine methane, for example. And in addition to the two main mitigation scenarios, we also added a sensitivity scenario that's based on the deep mitigation scenario, but considers additional and highly uncertain reductions from emerging measures for reducing enteric fermentation methane. Because these technologies are really still being developed with limited or no commercialization yet, we decided not to include them in our main modeling scenarios because the market adoption trends are expected on a very different timeline, and the cost and efficacy are still very speculative. Also, as you can see from the line chart, the sensitivity results shows that in 2030, the adoption of 2030, there's this drop here, and that reflects the adoption of synthetic methane inhibitors, such as 3-NOP-phe additives that could reduce enteric fermentation methane emissions by 13%, or about 50 million tons of CO2 equivalent annually. These inhibitors have a technical methane reduction potential on the orders of about 30% and are expected to be commercially available within the next few years, but currently faces major cost barriers. Then in the later years, we can see that we model the adoption of commercially available methane inhibiting vaccines after 2040, and this can provide additional methane reductions, about 15% for enteric fermentation methane. And this was based on analysis that was recently done, but the reduction efficacy is still a bit speculative because the vaccine is currently still in the development phase. And other major barriers include costs and also the changes in veterinary practices that are needed in order for wide-scale adoption of these methane inhibiting vaccines. But nevertheless, if they were to be deployed, it could result in an additional 27% reduction in methane emissions in the enteric fermentation sector by 2060. Next, we'll turn to look more at the reduction potential for different sectors between the different scenarios. So these first two charts are showing the methane emission reduction potential by subsector, and they're kind of color-coded to reflect the main sector which they represent. If we compare the two scenarios, we can see that there's a slightly greater reduction potential under the deep mitigation scenario as expected with the deployment of more measures. And there's also reflecting an accelerated adoption of mitigation measures due to faster deployment, for example, of VAM mitigation measures by 2030, and also a faster phase down of coal consumption with accelerated clean energy transition. Then if we look at the green, kind of different shades of green bars, we can see that there's also greater agriculture methane reduction potential in the deep mitigation scenario. And this is due to the application of higher cost changes to irrigation practices for rice cultivation, as well under the deep mitigation scenario, which can reduce an additional 47 million ton of CO2 equivalent in 2030. And so overall, the implementation of higher cost mitigation measures, including anaerobic treatment with gas recovery and utilization, just as one example, under the deep mitigation scenario can result in additional wastewater methane reductions. And that's why you see this blue bar in the deep mitigation scenario, but not in the cost-effective scenario. This next chart is a waterfall chart that shows the 2030 reference as well as the 2030 cost-effective mitigation scenario total methane emissions, and also shows the reduction potential by sector for 2030. We can see in 2030, most of the mitigation potential exists in the energy sector, right here, which accounts for about 63% of total potential for that year. And then overall, compared to the reference level, there's about a 30% reduction in methane emissions under this cost-effective mitigation scenario. If we look at the same results for the deep mitigation scenario, also for 2030, we can see that there's greater methane reduction potential in the energy, agriculture, as well as wastewater sectors. Under the deep mitigation scenario, about half of the methane mitigation potential is from the energy sector, followed by the agriculture sector. And as mentioned earlier, there's this new reduction potential in the wastewater sector under the deep mitigation scenario. Next, we'll turn to look at a very large and a little bit complex chart that will take a little bit of time to unpack, but essentially this figure shows a cost curve that we developed to show the average subsector cost of abatement for methane, which is reflected in the y-axis here, and also the associated emission reduction potential in 2030 on the x-axis. And this is shown for the deep mitigation scenario. So in terms of how we came up with this chart, we first derived the specific abatement costs for individual measures from 4 main sources, including the US EPA's global study, 2 YASA studies, and also an earlier China-specific study that was published with China-specific costs for different mitigation measures. We then screened the applicability of the different measures based on our scenario definition thresholds of $10 and $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent, and combined the average cost data for different measures from the literature with the methane reduction potential of specific measures that was calculated by our model in order to generate this cost curve. And if we kind of dig into the cost curve to look at some of the numbers, if we start from the left, we can see that, as I mentioned earlier, switching to intensive aquaculture systems that are aerated and well managed has a net benefit of $107 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And a sizable reduction of over 100 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2030. So here is showing a negative cost, which means essentially there's a net economic benefit. And this is primarily due to the higher stocking density of the intensive aquaculture systems, which can result in higher fish production and revenue that far offsets the additional cost of the system. Then if we look at these two other measures with negative costs, we can see that biochar application as well as drainage in the agriculture system and utilizing high concentration coal mine methane for power generation also have negative abatement costs, but the reduction potential for each of these measures are slightly lower. In terms of the greatest reduction potential, we can see that comes from VAM in the coal mining sector, which has well over 200 million ton of CO2 equivalent reduction potential in 2030 at a relatively low average abatement cost of just above $6 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And then if we turn to the very right-hand side of the chart, we can see that there are a group of measures with higher abatement costs, including above $25 per ton of CO2. And these include water and fertilizer management and rice cultivation, on-site use of lower concentration coal mine methane, oil sector mitigation, as well as enteric fermentation. And together, these higher cost measures provide another 164 million ton of CO2 equivalent of methane reduction in 2030, coming to this total of 660 million ton. And then if you average the costs across all of these bars, then it comes out to about $6.40 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And then shifting gears and moving forward a little bit, if we look at 2060, and in terms of looking at the total emissions as well as the reduction potential, we can see that there's a 36% reduction in methane emissions under the cost-effective scenario compared to the reference scenario. And we can see that the largest source of methane mitigation is really in the agriculture sector, which accounts for more than half of the mitigation potential. The energy sector is then the second largest source of reductions, and the reduction potential is mainly from abandoned coal mines as well as reduced coal production. And the waste sector contributes the smallest source of methane mitigation potential. And if we turn to look at the deep mitigation scenario, we can see that there's additional 75 million ton of CO2 equivalent of reduction potential by 2060 that's scattered across these different sectors. And this is with additional consideration, for example, of wastewater measures and also application of changes to irrigation practices for rice cultivation. And so under the deep mitigation scenario, by 2060, there is a 42% reduction possible relative to the reference level for 2060. And so next we have these 5 pie charts. And these 5 pie charts are really showing the total methane emissions that are scaled to the relative size of the pie. So you can see that they're all different sizes. And also the colors represent the distribution of the emissions by different sources. So if we start from the left, you can see we have the historical 2015 estimate as a kind of a baseline for comparison for the current or relatively current situation. And then we have the 2060 total emissions by source for the different scenarios. And here we included the sensitivity scenario as well. So first, if we look across all of these scenarios, we can see that there's a notable decrease in both the absolute amount of methane emissions, so that's how big the pie is, as well as the relative methane emissions from the energy sector in particular. So you can see that the yellow slices are getting smaller and smaller across all the different scenarios. And this is primarily owing to decreased methane emissions from coal mining. Over time, however, we can also see, particularly comparing 2050 and 2060, there is an increase in wastewater methane emissions, which is shown by the blue slices here. And this is due primarily to growth in drivers such as industrial activity, as well as limited mitigation measures with costs below $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. Then if we look at the green sections, we can see that the agricultural emissions in 2060 really continues to account for half of the total methane emissions in almost all of the scenarios. And most of this is coming from this kind of darker shaded or medium shaded green, which represents the emissions coming from enteric fermentation, where there's limited mitigation measures that exist. So overall, these results really emphasize that there's a need for continued focus on methane mitigation opportunities in the agriculture and wastewater sectors in the future, which represents the majority of remaining methane emissions in 2060. So in conclusion, as shown in the different types of charts we presented earlier, we identify significant potential for reducing methane emissions in China by 2030 as well as 2060. We found that in 2030, 660 million ton of CO2 equivalent of reduction is possible with a low average abatement cost of $6 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And this translates to about 34% reduction relative to a reference scenario of growth. But if we consider more uncertain and costly manure management, biomass, as well as some of the emerging enteric fermentation measures, then the total reduction potential could kind of increase to 760 million tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. And this jumps to a 39% reduction relative to the reference scenario. Across the different scenarios, coal mining will remain a key source of methane emissions, but there are also high uncertainties around coal mine methane emissions in the near term, as we demonstrated with the uncertainty analysis around just the emission factor. And abandoned coal mine methane, which we include in this study, is still not very well studied, and there's a lack of good data on that analysis as well. In the agriculture sector, aquaculture and fisheries, as well as biochar applications and rice cultivation, could help reduce methane emissions at a net economic benefit. But these measures really need more support to be pursued more rigorously in both research and development, as well as implementation, as they're not widely known or widely used currently. And lastly, additional research is needed to better understand emerging measures in enteric fermentation, as well as addressing remaining methane emissions in agriculture and wastewater sectors, which are expected to grow out in 2060, including possibly the use of behavior-based measures. So with that, I'll wrap up the presentation portion and turn it back over to Ken.
Thanks, Nina. That was really great presentation. It's interesting to me how much the agriculture sector is contributing and how difficult it may be to control those emissions. I know that it's a place where there's a lot of research and work being done in California, and maybe a very interesting place to have a good exchange between California and China. So let me turn now to our expert panel. We have a very distinguished panel today, and I'll introduce all three of our speakers and then turn it over to the panel. Our first speaker is Xiaopu Sun. She's a senior China counsel at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, with over a decade of experience working on advancing the reduction of short-lived climate pollutants, including methane, through regulatory measures and incentives, as well as international mechanisms. We also have Professor Chen Hulin from the School of Atmospheric Sciences in Nanjing University. His research interests include the carbon cycle and atmospheric greenhouse gases, and he is currently leading a project on evaluation of methane emission estimates using satellite and surface monitoring in China. Our third speaker is Chen Mian, the program director and senior analyst at the Institute for Global Decarbonization Progress. Her research focuses on climate change policy analysis and database development, carbon markets, non-CO2 greenhouse gas emission mitigation, and she's been involved in research projects as part of the Global Methane Initiative. So a great group of speakers, and I can turn it over now to Xiaopu.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you to the LBL team for inviting me to this webinar today. As John and others mentioned earlier, methane mitigation is the single most important strategy for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoiding catastrophic climate tipping points in the near term. So it's very exciting to see that in the run-up to COP28 and beyond, fast action to cut methane in two of the largest methane emitters, the United States and China, have improved forward, and we're looking forward to further outcomes from the Biden and Xi bilateral meeting. We have, as a long-term collaborator with the LBL team and CCCI, the California China Climate Institute, have seen research and analysis by LBL and other organizations playing a very instrumental role in advising on the development of the China's Methane Action Plan, as well as the US-China bilateral engagement. Moving forward, especially built upon this great research by the LBL team, I'd like to share a couple thoughts with you all today on additional areas of research that can further guide the Chinese agencies and ministries, as well as their advisors, on how, in the future to strengthen China's methane mitigation action and further raising their methane mitigation ambition. So first of all, I think built upon this great research, Nina and Jiang, you just presented, it might be helpful to consider further analytical work to assess on the methane mitigation targets that should be included in China's 2035 NDCs, reflecting reductions aligned with the Paris Agreement 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal. This is part of the Sunnyland statements, as US-China both made the commitments to include such targets in their 2035 NDCs. These assessment could also be supplemented by a quantitative analysis on, what's the potential methane mitigation, both the comprehensive potential as well as sectoral methane mitigation potential from a very effective implementation of China's Methane Action Plan, as well as from further strengthening the plan ambition. In this regard, I would also like to mention that, it is useful to understand the 2035 NDCs is not where the US and China will commence action on the goals reflected in the Sunnyland statement. Neither will the NDCs be the only document that determines China's climate actions and targets, especially in this decade, the decade of action. So this additionally, this analytical work is urgently needed because we do not see a comprehensive methane reduction goal included in China's methane emission control action plan yet. Many of the sectoral targets that are included in the plan are reiteration of pre-announced targets. With that, I would also like to move on to a couple thoughts on what are the policy gaps and how we can help address them. So in the Methane Action Plan, there's a particular emphasis on promoting the synergetic control of pollutants and methane emissions. There are indeed very helpful lessons learned from China's battle against air pollution, and these can be elaborated further to, as I mentioned, identify and address the policy gaps for strengthening China's methane mitigation action. These include, as Nina mentioned earlier, LBL study also confirmed that data is one of the major contributor of modeling uncertainties. In fact, the importance of data quality and transparency was critical and played a major role for China's battle against air pollution. For example, the Chinese national government does publish city-level air pollution data on a monthly basis. Enterprises in heavily polluting industries are also required to publish their emissions data for public supervision. With regard to methane mitigation, we have seen that in China's methane action plan, there are number of provisions on methane emissions measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification. This would all lay solid foundation for further strengthening China's methane data accessibility and supervision. Additionally, I would also like to echo what Ken mentioned on the importance of subnational priorities, especially for the consideration of how the subnational targets, ambition, commitments can support the development of national targets. By way of the example, I would also like to recall, in China's air pollution control policies, there have always been the regional and industry priorities that were highlighted. Subnational leadership on methane and commitments on methane could be pursued under the collaborative arrangements reached between California and subnational governments in China. I know a lot of folks here are very familiar with those recent developments. These include the MOUs that are signed between California and the provinces of Guangdong, Jiangsu, Hainan, and the municipalities of Beijing and Shanghai. We believe that these collaboration between California and these localities would be instrumental, can forge paths to more ambitious actions eventually at the national level. With that comes to my last but not least observation and point is, as we talk about what China could do nationally and subnationally, there's also the focus on the global methane cooperation, right? Additional research could be carried out to help identify these policy opportunities and action items for China's engagement in the global methane cooperation. The Methane Action Plan highlights certain platforms such as the Belt and Road Initiative and the South-South Cooperation on Climate Change, within which China could really play a leadership role on promoting methane mitigation efforts. We hope further research can shed light on mechanisms for incorporating methane mitigation into these platforms, including policies, for example, reducing methane emissions from China's imports and exports. There are existing, for example, Belt and Road Initiative policy guidance documents focusing on green infrastructure and green investment. Those can be applied or strengthened to cover some of these aspects. So these are some of my initial thoughts and reflection. Your comments and questions are more than welcome. With that, I pass the floor back to Ken.
Thanks, Xiaopu. I think we can go directly to Professor Yulin.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, it's also my pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. As has been said already, this is a very timely study. And with Jiang and Nina has showed their large potential methane reductions in China, which actually would be very important for coming years to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not beyond CO2, but also methane, N2O, and HFCs. Well, I'm an atmospheric scientist. I used to actually look at their how to quantify the emissions from various sources, and especially actually inspired by the figure Nina showed just now. There were actually about 80% of uncertainty on the coal mine emissions, and if there are such a large uncertainties on coal mine emissions, and then the mitigation measures would be also inevitably affected. So with that, I actually have prepared a couple of slides trying to tackle this this issue a bit more. Let me see, I can share my slides. I think you see my slides here. Yeah, so that I'm going to talk about the challenges in quantifying coal mine methane emissions. To start that, I start with this figure. So on the left, you show their coal mine related emissions of methane. On top panel, it shows the projections from 2010 to 2100. And you can classify the two categories. Underground coal mine is dominating the emissions of methane, with surface methanes play a small fraction. But if you look at the type of emissions and both their coal mine and the abandoned coal mine, this AMM, is also increasing. From Nina's slides, we saw that their abandoned coal mine mitigation only started later in 2040. But in fact, if the coal mine is phased out in the coming years, faster speed, then the abandoned coal mine will become more important. And in terms of the type of emissions for the underground coal mine, the dominant emission type of coal mines, they were mainly vented to the atmosphere directly. But there's also a fraction that has been collected but emitted to the atmosphere at later stages. And then in terms of their abandoned and surface coal mining, and also the coal in later storage, transportation, the use, there are diffusive or fugitive emissions coming out of all these categories. And so far, I think majority of these emissions been started using so-called inventory studies, using activity data multiplied by emission factors, which has a large uncertainties. And there's ongoing work on quantification of these emissions using atmospheric measurements. For example, there's more and more satellite missions, and especially with this high resolution satellites that can quantify their large pollutant sources coming from coal mines, from landfills. But the precision or the threshold of detecting the emissions from pollutant sources are still rather high, and there's still a lot of room to improve. For example, Nina mentioned there are two types of methane emissions that have not been started much, and especially the one case is associated with coal mine is abandoned mining methane emissions. And these are the two studies of abandoned mine methane emissions in China. You can see that among the two different inventory studies, there are also large differences and relatively large uncertainties. And in the future, that's probably the uncertainty is going to be larger if we are not going to quantify their emissions better, both using inventories to improve the emission factors, and also from atmospheric measurements to as a top-down to improve these estimates. On the individual coal mine shafts, so the dominant emissions from underground coal mines, we can see that their methane emissions are sort of being monitored. They're usually as a methane sensor at their ventilation shaft, and the flow rate can be also estimated as well. And then in principle, the methane emission coming out of one single ventilation shaft can be calculated. However, those monitoring were not meant to actually accurately monitor methane emissions, but rather to safety issues. And their accuracy is also yet to be improved. In 2017 and 2018, we performed a intensive campaign in South Poland, in the Upper Silesia areas. So the dotted line shows their coal mine ventilation shafts. And this is actually rather a large area of coal mine emissions, or the only large coal mine related emissions in Europe. And there are about 59 active ventilation shafts, and that account for a majority, or 82% of their total methane emissions. And another 18% were captured but vented. And during the campaign, there's a list of different platforms where there are majority of aircraft, and also ground-based FTS, and also UAVs. So my group participated in this campaign using a UAV to quantify methane emissions. And the next few slides, I'm going to share the results where we made using the UAVs. And the aircraft are aimed to quantify their individual coal mines, but also the regional emissions. While the drones, with the drone, we flew downwind of individual ventilation shafts. Here, so you see 5 with a multiple quantification of the methane emission coming out of ventilation shafts, and compared with their inventory studies. And this is a time series of the quantifications. On our right, if you look at the UAV quantified methane emissions versus their annual mean inventory estimates, we found very little or nearly no correlation between the two types of quantifications. But if we look at their UAV quantified emissions versus their hourly inventory, which is their quantified using the methane sensor inside the ventilation shaft, we found a relatively high R-squared values that allow us to actually also upscale the emission from individual ventilation shaft to the regional scales. A summary of the studies from this campaign using, this is their inventory on the left and aircraft quantification, the UV quantifications of methane on the left. You could see that, yeah, we were able to quantify the emissions from the single ventilation shaft to the regional scales, but they also have relatively large uncertainty as well. There's still a long way actually to go to better quantify the emissions, and I don't think there's a single method that can do the whole work. There must be also a combination of different techniques and in combination of atmospheric measurements using surface and satellite measurements, and also their detailed inventory studies, improving their activity data, improving their emission factors. And with this, I think a better quantification would help mitigate methane emissions in the future. And in the combination of the two, I hope that we'll really realize what Nina has presented. There will be a deep methane mitigation in China and in the coming decades. With this, I give the floor back to the panel, to Ken.
Thank you. Really interesting set of slides and challenges around the measurement. I wasn't aware of how difficult it is. Thank you for that. And now I can pass it over to Director Mia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ken. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. And I'd like to start with some source on the analysis presented by Nina and Dr. Lin Jiang. I think the analysis is very useful, especially at this point. As you mentioned, China just released its national methane plan. So the results of your analysis can inform different stakeholders for developing their own action plans. For example, like they can take quick actions to reduce methane in the area that already have a lot of cost-effective technologies. But for the hard-to-abate area, the stakeholders might provide more support for innovations in technologies, policy, and also the business model. So I noticed the research also includes some additional source, such as abandoned coal mines and also aquaculture. With China's energy transition, I think we're going to see more like abandoned coal mines. So I think it's very useful to include methane emissions from abandoned coal mines. And also, I don't think China's current GHG inventories actually include the methane emissions from the abandoned coal mines. So that'd be very useful. Yeah. And regarding to the mitigation potentials, there were like I noticed like in your slides you covered biochar and also the straw application to rice cultivations. So I just have like 2 observations about that. So for the cost of the, I'm just a little bit concerned about the cost of biochar because there were so many smallholders, farmers in China, and so I just worried, not worried, I just concerned like the cost, if the cost of the biochar is like affordable for them. if they want to have like fully deployment of the biochar by 2030. Another thing about is about the straw application to rice cultivation. We saw there were some like mixed findings in the mitigation effects. It seems like under some circumstances, the straw application can also increase methane emissions in rice cultivations. Yeah. So so next, I would also like to share some of our preliminary analysis on the methane mitigation potentials of China's new methane plan. And we're going to share the screen. Sorry. I don't think I can share my screen.
There should be a green, do you see a green share screen button at the bottom of the
Yes, yeah, I did. And when I click on sharing, they want me to open system preference about, yeah. Okay, it doesn't work.
Oh,
yeah,
I'm
but
sorry. Yeah, I think
no, it's
Professor
okay. I
Kim
can
was able to share, but
sorry, yeah, but it's okay. I can just share some of our preliminary analysis about this China's national methane plan. So because this is China's first master methane plans, and it actually covers all the major emission sources in China's methane emissions, including like energy, agricultural, and waste. And also there are a lot of like specific actions that are already included in these new methane plans, such as like increase the coal-bed methane capture and use, and also like biogas recovery from livestock manure, and also the waste water sludge, etc. So we know China actually did not set a target for the total methane emissions in this new national methane plan, but it actually includes a lot of sector-specific targets for 2025. So they have like the annual coal-bed methane capture and use target, and also the resource utilization rate for urban domestic waste, and also the harmless disposal rate of urban sludge. So we think we actually, in our analysis, we included these different sector-specific targets, and we developed a scenario analysis based on, so we have like 3 different scenarios. So for the reference scenario, it's mainly based on the China's implementation of the announced policy targets in 2020. And for the new policy scenario, we have actually included all the policies in the 14th five-year plan, and also the new methane plan. And in the best policy scenario, actually considers all the feasible mitigation practices. So our key findings is, in this new policy scenario, China's methane emissions will reduce by 17% in 2035 compared to 2022. And also compared to the reference scenario between 2022 and 2035, so the cumulative emissions reduction is about 2.3 billion tons of CO2e. And the reason why we want to choose 2035 is because China's new methane plan is in line with China's 14th five-year plan and its long-term objectives for 2035. So we want to estimate methane mitigation potentials these new policies have by 2035. So actually, in these cumulative emission reductions between 2022 and 2035, there were like 66% of mitigation potentials from the energy sectors, and 28% from agriculture sectors, and 6% is from the waste sectors. We also actually noticed that there are a lot of like this new methane plan, if they combined with the existing green and low carbon policies, can further unlock the methane mitigation potentials. The existing green and low carbon policies, including, for example, China's energy transition policies. We know like the share of coal in China's primary energy consumption, we're going to gradually decline. And also China actually has been encouraging the use of low methane concentration coal-bed methane and ventilation air methanes. Some other policies also including the circular economic promotion. China has policy about zero waste city pilot programs, and also its new waste laws. And some other policies, including, for example, the relaunch of China's CCER scheme, that is China's voluntary carbon market. And this can provide more like economic incentives for the methane reduction projects. So I will stop here, and thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you for those observations. We have a few minutes for a couple of questions, and I want to invite Zhang and Nina to either ask questions or if you have comments, definitely weigh in. One question that I have for any or all, I saw that the methane action plan includes a lot of focus on MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification. And I'm wondering, you know, where the new satellites fit in and what possibilities you see to really engage with that and beef up what we understand about inventories. And Zhang, I see you have your hand up, so feel free.
Can your questions address to any particular panelists or just broadly overall, or?
I would say broadly overall.
Okay. Anybody else want to answer that first? If not, I may just make a couple of comments, and also I have a question for Professor Chen as well. First of all, I think we have heard over the last few years, we've been working with Chinese colleague on the uncertainty of data, right? That's one the major barrier for action. People are worried about they just don't know enough or don't know with enough confidence. So it's very good to see in China's methane action plan, MRV was called, you know, out as one of the first things, priority to address. You know, I think it's terrific. And we're very pleased to hear the work done by Professor Chen and other colleagues, including China's own satellite, that started improving the data collection and sharing. The second, I think Dr. Chen mentioned that, you know, in China's current GHG inventory system, methane may not be, or at least some part of the methane are not even included. So that creates additional sort of gap in data. Hopefully with the new methane action plan, this gap can be filled. We are actually just about to finalizing a separate report on, you know, what are the good practice for MRV systems for non-CO2 greenhouse gases, including methane. We'll be happy to share that, you know, once it's coming out, probably in a month or so. That's, you know, we are working on that with many Chinese colleagues on that. I have a clarification to the question Dr. Chen raised on rice straw utilization, biochar, etc. We are fully aware that improper reuse of rice straw could create additional methane emissions. That phenomenon actually is being studied quite well by many Chinese agricultural scientists. So there's, you know, large experiment going on in China of how to manage that, how to turn that into, you know, biochar that can actually reduce. So some of our uncertainty analysis around that estimates are about how prevalent the different usage patterns are, you know, you know, what a percentage of rice straw are returned now, what are actually not returned, what are being processed. So there's, you know, still work to be done to understand the current usage pattern on that. In terms of the cost, those are costs are also based on China-based studies. There's actually many experiments going on in China. So the cost data on biochar collected are from China using, you know, Chinese technology. So right now, based on our current summary of the research in China, it is a negative cost, which means that by utilizing biochar, you're increasing yield, you know, getting more revenue from that. So that's sort of a point on that. On the question for Professor Chen, it's really great to see the work you're doing in measurement, particularly understanding sort of the point estimates and a sort of at a time resolution. It seemed to me you're saying on a daily basis, the measurement between monitoring and remote sensing has a much better sort of alignment than the aggregate annual emission, which is really interesting to know. How do you, what factors do you attribute that to, that you actually have better understanding of the emissions on a regular basis versus the annual estimates? What would be your explanation for that difference?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Lin, for the question. What I showed actually a direct measurement of a ventilation shaft methane emissions. Well, the reported inventories often give you the annual mean. Well, you can downscale that to understand the emission rate coming out of individual ventilation shafts. But the fact is, the methane emissions is related with the activities inside the coal mines, and their emission rate by no means is constant over time. So actually, it's all you can see it's no surprise that their emission rate is not constant. But then, of course, from the monitoring perspective, if you, for example, one can use a satellite, high-resolution satellite, to quantify a large emission source coming from ventilation shafts. But the thing is that you have to be aware. I mean, our study shows that you have to be aware the emission rate isn't constant. What you actually quantify once in space, in time, doesn't mean that you get a good handle of the total emissions out of the coal mining ventilation shaft or the areas. So there are certain statistics must be needed. So you need to measure multiple times at different times, so they can get a better ideas about total emissions coming from a large pollutant source. I think that's a bit to take a whole message of that study. And we also call for accurate measurement of methane and the flow rate inside the ventilation shafts. And with that, you will be actually monitored constantly and accurately.
Right. I understand most of Chinese coal mines do have a continuous measurement and monitoring of methane release, right? So those data should be available somewhere in China.
Yeah, I recently heard a talk at coal mine methane events in Xuzhou. Yes, and those devices are being upgraded at the moment, actually. So that when you mentioned there were measurements in the coal mines, they may not at high quality, which is the case also in Poland. You can, of course, upgrade those devices to measure the methane concentrations more accurately than before. And that in principle would allow us to actually better estimate emissions. I think this is pretty much a work in progress, not something already available on the table.
Yeah, and we'll see the launch of quite a number of satellites in the first quarter of next year. And I know that the School of Engineering here at Berkeley is working on some sensors and drones and robots for landfills that may also have some application for coal mines. Well, thank you. Great panel. We're gonna now move to our closing remarks, and we are joined by Dr. Manjot Ahluwalia, who is the regional lead for Asia at the Global Methane Hub. In her current role, Manjot is responsible for driving and delivering the hub's methane mitigation strategy and projects across high impact sectors and geographies in Asia that bring direct socioeconomic benefits to countries and communities. So Manjot, over to you for your remarks.
Thank you, Ken, for the introduction, and good evening and good morning to everyone. And thank you once again to the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab for organizing this webinar, a very timely one indeed, and the esteemed panelists for their insights into China's opportunities and potential for methane mitigation. As Ken mentioned, I am working at the Global Methane Hub as the regional lead for Asia. And it's a philanthropic fund with a mission to provide catalytic support and funding to governments, to subnational actors, civil society, researchers, private sector, to reduce methane emissions across energy, agriculture, and waste. This is aligned to the 1.5C goal of a 35% reduction in methane by 2030 and 50% by 2050. And many of our investments, we hope, will deliver direct benefits of health, nutrition, livelihoods, dignity, better environmental justice for the communities where action is taken. And we work across all regions of the world, but with a major focus on key emitters and low and middle income countries, because those are the countries, especially in the global south, that are going to endure a significant increase in methane emissions with increase in GDP and population, all things remaining the same. So as many have said before me, we are extremely pleased to see the recent release of the much anticipated National Methane Emissions Control Plan. And I'm not going to pass out every detail of it since the experts before me have done that. But just to say that this is a positive step forward and indeed lays the groundwork for more ambition. And also some of the things that really stuck out from our vantage point are that, while the methane plan may need some overall quantification of a methane target, as the world's largest methane emitter, this is, from our point of view, the first detailed methane blueprint of any country, with some indicative measures across key sectors such as coal, gas, livestock, waste, and wastewater, as mentioned before, aligned with the conclusion of the 14th year plan, so up to 2025 with reference to 2030. And given the plan was signed not only by the key ministry, MEE, but also by the other 10 national ministries and agencies, this really demonstrates the whole of government approach that China is taking to addressing methane, and really, sends a signal that methane is a priority across the key sectors of China's economy. And this also, as mentioned before, elevates the importance of enhanced data and MRV, both ground level and remote sensing, to drive consistency of data, accountability, transparency, accessibility, which further informs policymaking and helps track national progress. And last but not the least, as Shapu also mentioned, and so did Ken, it does give the air beneath the wings to the provincial governments in China to implement their own methane targets and help with the bottom-up implementation and support the national government in its overall national methane plan. In addition to the domestic signals, the plan also sends an important signal to the global community. As many of you know, in the lead up to COP and the global stocktake this year, it's going to be very important to elevate methane as the lever we need in the short term. And this plan really lays the foundation to help other countries also enhance ambition and prioritize methane in the next set of climate pledges, and also spurs discussion in the community on what may be needed together, including climate finance, to deliver on that ambition. And I also wanted to underscore the importance of this international collaboration and cooperation that we witnessed even in our recent climate history, right, that has led us to this point. As many of you know, in the climate community, right from the successes of the ubiquitous ratification and success of the Montreal Protocol to the US-China cooperation that paved the way for the historic Paris Agreement, and then an ushering of a new promising era of US-China collaboration through the US-China Joint Glasgow Declaration on enhancing climate in the 2020s, where methane is one of the bright spots opening the door for cooperation on other climate issues. And this also includes yesterday's, as others mentioned, the Sunnyland statement on enhancing cooperation to address the climate crisis, both by US and China, that Dr. Liu also noted, to collectively pursue efforts to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030, build and support on their respective national methane action plans for both China and the US, and help develop methane reduction targets And the significant piece here, again, is inclusion of methane in the 2035 NDC. And China, for the first time, will include non-super pollutants, non-CO2 super pollutants in its 2035 NDC with specific methane reduction targets, hoping for absolute reductions in the power sector in the 2020s. And, you know, just from my time in having lived and worked in the Global South and being from there, all this to say we must ensure that the solutions to climate change need to be country-led and country-driven. And really, this is something in support of the development priorities that are needed in the Global South. And this also includes meaningful engagement of not just the national governments, but also subnational actors, academia, industry associations, social organizations, and civil society. And China did mention in its plan the South-South cooperation that others alluded to. And this is vital here, since countries, especially in the ASEAN, with similar development trajectory and capabilities and political realities, can actually learn the best practices. For instance, building on technologies for coal mine methane utilization, which probably is a common challenge across, you know, the Global South, including breakthroughs in agriculture, for example, enteric fermentation. And collectively, we can raise ambition and support implementation. I'm speaking to you all from Manila, Philippines, where I'm actually attending the 11th Better Air Quality Conference. And day one was yesterday, which emphasized the severe health risks posed by air pollution to nearly 2.3 billion people in the Asia-Pacific region alone, and the region's vulnerability to climate change, and especially for those working in high-risk sectors like agriculture. And the conference also highlighted that tackling air pollution requires collective efforts, emphasizing the importance of cross-border, cross-sector, and interdisciplinary international collaboration for a cleaner, healthier future. And what gives me hope is that with China's recent history in tackling air pollution and its acknowledgement of methane as a precursor of tropospheric ozone and harmful co-pollutants, I'm hopeful it can share its best practices and technologies to reduce air pollution in the region. I'd like to conclude by thanking partners at LBNL. We also support the California China Climate Institute and IGSD and appreciate their thought leadership and analysis and hard work that has collectively contributed to really bringing this positive development from China. And as GMH, we look forward to continuing supporting you all, as well as others of our partners working in China to rein in on this momentum, help China and other countries deliver on their plans. And indeed, together, we have a rare opportunity to address the climate crisis for the people and the planet within this lifetime if we can tackle methane. So thank you again for this opportunity to address you all at this pivotal moment. And hopefully we all can, you know, celebrate today. And I know there's work to be done. Have a great evening and a great day ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your remarks. It's I'll echo your moment of optimism here, hopefully for a start of action and implementation, and really timely, great report and great comments about it. So thank you to all of the panelists, to Lawrence Berkeley Labs, to the Global Methane Hub, and to UC Berkeley. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.